Now, when we do the talk story, we talk story, which means that I start off with a Hawaiian legend related to the topic. And so that's what I'll do right now. I'm going to tell a story from the Big Island. Well, actually it goes from the Big Island to another island, but it begins here. And it's about a young man who was the son of a chief of Hilo. The way we start is like this. Ikawakahiko, Amua o Kapeta Kuke. Once upon a time, before Captain Cook, there was a young man named Kepaka. He was the only son at this time of the chief of Hilo. Now he was young and strong and handsome, like all Hawaiian heroes, right? In all the stories. And he got old enough to seek a wife. So his father sent out friends and relatives all over the island, trying to find the perfect mate for his son. So finally, Kepaka's uncle came and he says, I have found the perfect woman for you. Her name is Makolea, and she is a beauty. She has a back like a cliff, a face like a moon. Now, those are traditional phrases that you'll often hear in Hawaiian stories. A back like a cliff means she has a wonderful posture. She stands very straight, like all hula dancers are supposed to do. Okay? And a face like a moon, two things are interesting here. One, the most beautiful woman in all the legends of all Polynesia who represented beauty was Huna. And she was, among other things, the goddess of the moon. And so in those old days, the sense of beauty was a face that was round. Okay? Not flat, but a face that was round. That was their idea of great beauty at the time. So, this is how she was described. And she was the daughter of a chief of Kona. So immediately Kepaka got all ready and he went with his uncle and they traveled. It took them a few days to get across the island. They made it to Kona. And when they got to Kona down by the beach, this whole big crowd was milling around and they were shouting and wailing. And so the uncle came up and said, what's going on? What's the matter? And someone said, Makolea, the daughter of the chief, has been missing. And what happened? She was, different people told different stories, but it seemed like she was out surfing with her friends. And when they all gathered to come back, when they came back, they discovered that Makolea wasn't with them. They said, we're afraid she was swept out to sea and drowned. And then an old man spoke up and he says, no. He says, I'm a fisherman and I was out there when it happened. And this very fast sailing canoe came up and picked her up and headed off that way. And from Kona, he pointed northwest. So naturally, Kepaka was pretty upset about this. So he went to the chief and asked permission to go and find out where she was. And so the chief took a good look at him, knew his lineage, and decided he liked him. And so, okay, he sent him off to see what he could find out. So he went up and down the coast, asking everybody he could think of. Finally, after days of questioning, he discovered that it was a chief, a servant of a chief of the high chief of Kauai, who had come and snatched the girl because he had heard of the reputation of her beauty too. So Kepaka goes back to the chief of Kona and tells him what he found out and asks permission to go and get her. And the chief of Kona says, wait a second, you don't want to go up against the high chief of Kauai. He's big, he's strong, he's deadly, and if he doesn't kill you himself in the sports that he goes in, why, he'll destroy you with riddles. That sounds strange to us at first. But riddle playing was an art in ancient Hawaii. And such an art and the Hawaiians at those times, they didn't have Las Vegas, so they were inveterate gamblers among themselves, and they would always gamble, and the highest type of gamble was to gamble your bones. If you lost everything else, that would be the last thing you would gamble, which means the winner would kill you and, get rid of your flesh and take the bones and use them for something. So riddling was one of the things they used to bet on. And coming up with good riddles was a challenge, like I said, and an art. So anyway, that's why the chief of Kona said that. He might destroy you with his riddles. And Kepaka said, that doesn't concern me. I will go and rescue her or die trying. Well, the king says, okay. And he gave him a good canoe to go off and try and rescue Makulea the best he could. So off he sails to Kauai, which is almost exactly northwest of Kona. So off he goes, and again, a few days. It's not always easy traveling through the islands. Sometimes, even if you've got a brand new modern type of sailboat, just to let you know, I remember when I was on Kauai, a friend of mine, when he was a boy, would take a sailboat, inter-island cruiser, from Lihue to Honolulu, and it was $5. The only problem was, it might take you 2 weeks to get there, because when those trade winds come, and that just keeps everybody off. That's why when Captain Cook arrived, he saw Big Island. He saw Maui, he saw Molokai, he saw Oahu, but he could not land there. And because of the winds, he had to end up on Kauai. Until he went north and came down. Anyway, back to this story. Kepaka comes, and he lands. And of course, in a traditional form, when you were a stranger and you landed, people would want to know your standing. That was very, very important. So they knew how to treat you. That was extremely important in the days of the chiefs, because there were very strict rankings of the aristocracy. So you would be required to establish your lineage by chanting your ancestor. So he lands on the beach. He has the bearing of a chief, the clothing of a chief, and he gives the lineage of his father, who was chief of Hilo. So the chief of the district of that area where he landed came down and met him and greeted him personally. And he said, well, this is all well and good. What are you here for? He said, I've heard of the skill and the cleverness of your chief. And I think I'd like to observe it and even possibly play against him. So the district chief says, you might as well go home. Because once you see our chief, you're going to run as fast as your legs can carry. And Kepaka says, that doesn't concern me. I want to meet this chief. And the district chief, before he could start to interfere anymore and try and talk him out of it, heard the conch playing, the conch like this one. Used to play, the old chiefs, the high chief especially, would have heralds that go before them. You've seen probably in medieval European pictures where they blow the trumpets to announce that the king is coming. They did the same thing here in the islands. When the high chief was coming, they had heralds out in front blowing conchs. And so that's what they did, which announced the high chief was coming down the beach area. And there was actually a big, large field not too far from the beach. And there was a big crowd already building up because they knew the chief was coming down to challenge something. So the chief comes down, he's strutting like a fighting cock. He's got a red mallow, he has huge muscles, he's very tall, and he comes down looking for somebody to challenge and sees a stranger. He says, oh, stranger, have you come to play with me? And Kepaka says, possibly. He says, let's engage in some sports. He says, do you know how to throw a spear? Because he had a big voice. He was almost always shouting because he had such a big voice. And Kepaka says, I know a little bit about it, so I'm willing to try. So the chief says, fine, who's going to throw the spear first? And Kepaka says, well, you should, because the stranger should never be the first one to throw. Chief says, good. And so they stood apart a good distance. Chief had a corwood spear, hefts it in his hand, throws it right at Kepaka. And all you see of Kepaka is he moves his right arm a little bit. And the chief thought that he had struck him right through. And so he starts to do a victory chant, and then everybody sees Kepaka lift his right arm, and the spear falls down. He caught it under his arm. Oh! Chief was surprised. He said, well, that's not going to happen again, so he throws a second spear. This time, Kepaka moves his left arm a little bit, and when it's all over, he raises his left arm and the spear falls down. His left arm. And the chief says, well, this little man has a lot of skill. He says, how about another sport? And Kepaka says, if it's something I know, I'll be glad to try. And he says, wrestling. And Kepaka says, I don't know anything about wrestling. So isn't there anything else? How about boxing? Ah, okay. He says, I know a little bit about boxing. He says, so I'd be willing to try it. So now they get together, and Hawaiian boxing is not like Western boxing. You know, you get in a stance to protect. They didn't bother with the protecting part. Okay? You went up against your opponent with your fist like this. Open arm. And then when you were ready, you just wailed on it. Okay? So that was Hawaiian boxing. So they got prepared, and they got their fists, and they got ready to go. And right away, the chief hits Kepaka, knocks him backwards, but he doesn't fall down. So then Kepaka comes up before the chief can do anything else and hits the chief right in the chest, and wham, down he falls. So this time the chief slowly gets up, he's panting for breath, it takes him a while. He has to lean on one of his servants, and he says, all right, I'll get back to you. And he goes off to his sleeping house, okay, because he was hurt. So the district chief, of course, gives Kepaka a house, a place, and he also gives him his pick of servants. And of course, he presents them with all these young, beautiful, handsome servants to pick from, and but behind them, Kepaka sees an old man. He's got a tattered kihei, and kihei is like a cloak made of tapa cloth. He said he's got a malo, which is a breech cloth that's all worn, and he's got a staff that he's using like a cane, skinny. And Kepaka says, I'll take that one. Now make sure he gets the best of clothing, make sure he gets fed well, and when that's all done, bring him to me. And so he was the son of a chief, and he had the privileges and ranks of that chief, so they had to obey him, and they did that. So now, while this is happening, a messenger comes from the high chief's compound and says that in 4 days, there will be a riddling contest. And he expects the stranger to be there for that. And that goes away.
Did you say whittling?
Riddle. Like,
Riddling, okay.
Right. Not whittling. Okay. Riddling, right. This happens, and Kepaka, finally the old man is ready, that he had all fixed up, and he takes him over, and they're sitting under a tree. And Kepaka says, all right, now that I've brought you back into good condition, tell me your story. And the old man says, my name is Loea. He says, I used to be the kahu of the high chief. Now, kahu has a number of different meanings in Hawaiian. One of them is like an advisor, a caretaker, an attendant, the kind of King Kamehameha the Great used to have a kahu, and it was the kahu's job to make sure that the king exercised regularly. Okay, so it's that kind of coach, mentor, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, he used to be. He said, but the high chief didn't like some of the advice I gave him and he kicked me out. Since then, no one will have anything to do with me, and I've been almost like living like a slave. You are the first man who's ever shown me kindness. So I want to return that kindness to you. He's talking to Kepaka. And he says, I'm the one that taught the chief his riddles. Well, you know where that went. Okay? 4 days later, here comes the chief with all his retinue, all of his court. And he comes down, and of course he's proud and cocky and all of that kind of stuff the same way. And he says, all right. He says, little man, he says to Kepaka, he says, are you ready? And Kepaka says, well, he says, I don't know much about riddles, but I'm willing to try. So the chief says, the high chief says, all right, here's the riddle. This is what he chanted. They used to be chanted. Step around. Step to the bottom, leaving an open place. Now the translation is never very good too good for a lot of Hawaiian riddles, because one of the things they loved in their chants and their poetry, and in the old days, even in their language, was to speak in metaphors. So something was always standing for something else. So some of our riddles from Europe are that way too, but not like Hawaiians, they were all that way. So Kepaka steps forth, and he said, the answer is a house. Because a house is thatched all on the roof, all around the walls, and the only thing left is a doorway. Because Hawaiian houses didn't have any windows. So the chief was surprised because the answer was correct. And he said, all right, that won't happen again, because this next one is even harder. And so he goes to chant the next one. And the next one is, the men that stand, the men that lie down, the men that are folded. Kepaka waits for a while, then steps forth. And he says, the answer is also a house. The answer, the upright poles stand, the cross beams lie down, and the thatch is folded. Now, the chief was really stunned and very angry. And he clenched his fists, and all the crowd kind of gasped and waited, because the king was capable of killing him out of spite, even though he won. Whereas normally you would grant a reward of some kind. So they were waiting to see what the chief did, and finally the chief relaxed, let his hands go, even smiled. And the high chief said, a wise old man once told me, I'a noi kala okaikaika. He can be daring as long as he has strength. And this was a proverb, and everybody present knew what it meant. It meant that a strong man can be a bully until he meets somebody better. And so the chief said, I had forgotten how much I missed that wise man until I saw him standing next to you. So he came up, and he pressed noses, which is a Hawaiian form of kiss, with the old man, accepted him back to his side, and he said to Kepaka, you've won by your skill, your strength, and your wit. Whatever you ask for shall be yours. He didn't hesitate. He said, I ask for Makolea. The chief raised his eyebrows, shrugged, and had her brought. And remember, now he just went there to rescue her, but the moment Makolea set her eyes on this son of the chief of Hilo, young and handsome, of course by then she already knew everything that he'd been able to do. And the moment he set his eyes on her, well, long story short, they became lovers. He took her back to Kona. There they officially got married on the 11th night of the moon, which is always a traditional night for marriage, called Huna. And the high chief of Kauai guided by his cow, became wise and good himself. Behold a keka'au, so runs the story. Okay. Now, what is there in that story that we can learn from? Well, in order to really learn from it, I have to share the secret formula with you. Okay? And all you out there, okay. Here's the formula. It may sound a little bit familiar. E equals mc squared minus r. Okay, that one might throw you. Actually, somebody else used the first part, okay, for something else entirely. What does it mean when we're using it here? The E stands for effectiveness. So if you're looking at it this way, E equals mc squared. The M stands for motivation. The C squared stands for two things: concentration and confidence. The minus R stands for less resistance. That is the formula guaranteed for success of any kind in any endeavor. Now, it's a formula which only means that what people actually do was translated into a formula. In terms of what people do to be successful, that's what was observed first. And then what's another way to describe what they do? Well, then, in order to achieve anything, to be successful at anything, you have to have motivation. Okay? Motivation doesn't just mean desire. It means that which moves you to action. So it means a desire is strong enough to get your energy going so that you do something. That's motivation. Concentration, now we see motivation first of all, right at the beginning, almost at the beginning of the story with Kepaka, when he was talking to the Kona chief, and he decided, now see, this is an important thing. You don't wait to be motivated if something is important enough. He decided that he was going to rescue this girl, even if it took his life. That's a high motivation. And he didn't just say it. He got in the canoe and sailed off. Okay? So he had the high energy, the high motivation, right at the beginning of his adventure. He started motivation when he heard about her. Okay, great. But then when he got there and learned everything else, and his motivation got stronger, but it was a decision on his part. This is very important to understand. When you want to do really something very strongly or very important for you, you don't wait until it feels right. If you really want to accomplish it, you build up the energy. You make it important by your decisions and by your action and by stirring up your own feelings. So all of that is with motivation. The next thing was concentration. We see concentration in Kepaka because once he started, he didn't give up. He kept persisting until he got what he wanted. Now, it's a nice story. He got exactly what he wanted. In life, sometimes we find situations where we concentrate on something and we discover that conditions have changed so that we have to change our plans. Okay? Sometimes we have to even modify what it is we want to make it more possible for us. Sometimes we're tired of concentrating. Sometimes our motivation runs out. Okay? If you keep the motivation and keep the concentration, that gives you the best chances of getting as close as possible to what we want. So he did that. He showed confidence. Wow, did he show confidence time after time? We can see confidence as he showed courage. That's a little different. Courage comes from concentration, really focusing on what you want no matter what. Confidence comes when you don't have any doubt. And the way he responded to what the chief was challenging him with You can imagine in your mind's eye, the total confidence when he said, well, I don't really know that too well, but I'll be willing to try. Okay? But he was also very confident about what he didn't know. Wrestling, no, I don't think so. Not fearful, not thought people will think I'm a coward if I don't do it. No, he was so confident that it didn't bother him to turn something down and move on to something different. Okay? So confident is it's a state of reduced or no doubt. Now, it doesn't mean the whole thing was easy, because there's where we come with the next segment, which makes it a good idea for a formula. Because the next part of the formula was minus resistance. So what that means is you do something to reduce whatever resistance is in the way of what you want to do. And following a formula, when you have a minus on one side and you add to that minus, it makes the right side increase. When you increase motivation, the right side increases. When you increase concentration, the right side effectiveness increases. When you increase confidence, but when you reduce, well, that is, increase the reduction of resistance, then this increases also. That's why the formula is a good way to translate it in simple terms. So he reduced resistance. One thing that he did was let the chief go first in the spear throwing. Another thing that he did was let the chief hit first, because then he knew what he had to do, and he knew what the situation was. And the last thing he did was very cleverly pick out what was probably the wisest of that group of servants and cater to him, not knowing what he would gain, but knowing that he would gain something, which reduced the resistance even further, so that he won the riddling contest. So we see that operating. In our own lives, when we are reducing resistance, we do this in all kinds of ways. We can reduce resistance by increasing our motivation. See, this is the other side of the formula. You increase motivation. You need less concentration, less confidence, and your resistance goes down. If you increase concentration, that can make up for less need for motivation. Don't have to put as much energy into it all at once. You don't need as much confidence, and the resistance goes down. Same thing with confidence. The greater the confidence, the less motivation you have to have. If I want to get out here, and I want to take my car, and I want to drive it up to Mauna Kea, I just get in the car and do it. Concentration keeps me on the road, my confidence keeps me driving, I don't have to get all excited. Oh yes, I've got to go to Mauna Kea, got to do that more than anything in the world. At one time in my life, I might have needed that. But now I've got enough confidence that I don't need that much motivation. See? So each one of these things that you increase on this side of the formula reduces resistance also. And then you can just go ahead and straighten, reduce resistance, get things out of the way. One of the best ways for most people, most of the time, to reduce resistance towards something they want to accomplish is to declutter their house. I'm serious about that. It's amazing when you let clutter build up of whatever kind it is. Sometimes it's not just too much stuff. Sometimes it's unfinished projects lying around. It can be all kinds of things. There's a portion of your concentration which is always on that stuff. You can ignore it with your conscious mind, but your subconscious mind is always aware of all this stuff. And it distracts and reduces your concentration a great deal. And if we reduce concentration enough, then you start to lose motivation and confidence, and resistance builds up. So one of the simplest things to do, I don't mean you have to go to bare walls, but one of the simplest things to do is go through your stuff, and all the stuff that you don't need, that's really good shape, give it to Cooper Center. Because they can use it and they can share it out with other people, or some other place that you believe in. If it's stuff that you really like and you really love, then those are things that build your energy, help you concentrate, make you feel good. So that's why don't get rid of it for the sake of getting rid of it. But the stuff that no longer makes you feel good, no longer helps you live the way you want to live, those are the things you want to take a look at. That's an example of reducing resistance. Okay? So, though that's how the formula works for accomplishing anything, most simple thing and the biggest thing, earlier we heard something about doing big things. Well, saving the world is a big thing, but it would work for that. So it doesn't matter what it is you want to do, at any range, the formula works. Do you have any questions about any of these parts of the formula? Oh, I will mention before I say that, in the formula when we have resistance, let me tell you another kind of resistance that would be good to reduce. We have a term that we use called the FUDs. And the FUDs are what get in your way. The FUDs are what produce resistance. F-U-D-S. It stands for fear, unhappiness, which includes all forms of anger, doubt, and stress. Now the first three are going to stress you too, but even simple stress gets in your way when you've got too much of it. So those are the things, to any degree that you can reduce those, you're going to increase your effectiveness. With that, any questions about how to apply this or how to use it? Yes.
I have a question on the FUDs, if I may.
Yes.
Would you say that, under, can't remember, right, fear,
Unhappiness.
thank you, included all kinds of anger as
Yes.
well?
Right.
So you don't look at anger as a separate kind of a thing?
No, because anger is when you're unhappy with something. The thing is, grief is a form of anger. Guilt is a form of anger. Sadness is actually a mild form of anger because you're unhappy with the way things are as compared to the way things were. That's usually where sadness comes from. So it's always a kind of, you're resisting the fact of something. See? So that's why we put all those together in unhappiness.
Thank you.
And with fear includes anxiety and panic and all those kinds of things as well.